On a calm Pacific morning, a single mistake slipped through the silence. A routine radio message, meant to vanish into coded secrecy, expanded far beyond its narrow beam. Distant enemy stations captured instantly. In that brief moment, the hidden position of an entire American carrier group began to unfold, long before anyone aboard sensed the danger approaching. The long stretch of open Pacific water lay beneath a sky marked by soft layers of morning haze, creating an atmosphere that felt deceptively calm when compared to the tension building across the distant horizon. The American carrier group advanced in a steady formation, maintaining disciplined spacing as each vessel moved through the faint swells that rolled quietly beneath their hulls. The ships produced a harmonious rhythmic vibration that traveled outward, blending into the stillness of the early hours. This routine movement reflected the daily operations of naval forces that had been at sea for weeks, adapting to patterns of watch, communication, and preparation in a theater where uncertainty colored every decision. Deep within one of the escort vessels, the radio compartment remained dimly lit, filled with the continuous hum of electrical equipment. The men assigned to radio duties worked with careful precision, monitoring signals, transmitting coded messages, and maintaining silence whenever orders required. Every action inside that small room held importance, because communication represented the fragile bridge between scattered units operating across vast distances. The responsibility demanded unwavering focus, especially in a conflict where intercepted transmissions could reveal the position of an entire task force. During those early hours, the radio operator on duty managed a sequence of routine tasks with a steady rhythm gained through months of practice. He adjusted dials, verified frequency stability, and confirmed that outgoing messages aligned with established procedures. The shelves around him held code books, maintenance tools, and equipment that allowed the ship to coordinate its movement within the larger fleet. His environment felt enclosed and quiet, shaped by the sounds of static and the hum of machinery. Although the sea outside remained calm, responsibility inside the radio compartment carried a silent weight that accompanied every transmission. As the ship advanced deeper into a wide stretch of open sea, the operator attempted to complete a simple scheduled check-in, a routine confirmation that normally required only a brief coded signal. The procedure demanded accuracy because even minimal deviation could draw unwanted attention from distant enemy patrols capable of intercepting radio frequencies. Yet in that moment, a slight miscalibration of equipment combined with a small oversight in protocol created a shift in the transmission pattern. The signal that left the radio room no longer traveled along its intended narrow beam, but instead broadcast across a broader arc, reaching distances far beyond the operator's expectations. The Pacific remained vast, but the reach of radio technology allowed messages to cross incredible distances, and on that day, the unintended signal traveled outward into regions monitored by enemy forces. The moment passed quickly inside the radio compartment, unnoticed by most of the crew, yet the consequences of that single error began unfolding silently across the ocean. A simple transmission, extended farther than planned, had exposed faint clues about the location of the entire carrier group. Though no one aboard realized it yet, the quiet morning atmosphere concealed the beginning of an event that would alter the rhythm of the day and place the fleet at unexpected risk. The American carrier group advanced across a wide stretch of the Pacific with a sense of practice coordination that came from months of continuous movement. Each vessel maintained its assigned position, preserving the spacing required for effective defense while ensuring that communication lines remained stable throughout the formation. The carriers traveled at a measured pace, escorted by cruisers and destroyers that formed a protective ring around the larger ships. The morning light filtered through a pale haze, softening the outlines of the vessels and casting long reflections on the surface of the sea. The horizon appeared broad and quiet, yet every officer aboard understood that the apparent stillness concealed countless unseen dangers. Life aboard the ships followed a disciplined rhythm shaped by operational demands. Flight deck crews conducted equipment checks, securing cables and inspecting the condition of aircraft lined in precise rows. Mechanics worked with steady focus, verifying fluid levels, fastening components, and adjusting instruments necessary for the day's activities. Gunners positioned along the decks inspected their weapons with routine familiarity, cleaning surfaces and verifying that ammunition supplies remained organized and accessible. The faint smell of fuel, oil, and seawater drifted through the air, blending into an atmosphere that felt both mechanical and natural. Inside the operations rooms of the escort vessels, officers studied charts, updated navigation logs, and confirmed the fleet's projected path. They reviewed intelligence reports and assessed weather patterns expected in the coming hours. Although the carrier group moved through an area considered relatively secure, the unpredictability of the Pacific required constant vigilance. Reconnaissance aircraft operating from distant bases and submarine patrols across the region meant that any lapse in discipline could expose the fleet to sudden threat. The officers maintained steady attention to detail, aware that security depended on coordination between every vessel in the formation. Among these interconnected responsibilities, communication represented one of the most crucial components of fleet safety. Radio operators managed frequencies carefully, ensuring that outgoing transmissions followed established restrictions designed to minimize detection by enemy forces. Whenever radio silence was ordered, operators adhered strictly to procedure, listening for incoming signals but transmitting only when authorized. The risk of interception remained an ever-present concern because the enemy possessed both the equipment and the experience necessary to identify the patterns of naval communication. The balance between coordination and concealment defined the daily work within each ship's communication room. On the vessel where the critical error would occur, the radio compartment felt enclosed and almost isolated from the movement of the sea. Metal panels lined the walls, and the faint glow of equipment lights created a soft illumination across the narrow space. Instruments produced a constant hum, while static hissed intermittently through the headphones worn by the operator on duty. He had completed numerous shifts under similar conditions, developing habits shaped by repetition and familiarity. His hands moved automatically across controls and switches as he monitored frequencies and verified signal clarity. The operator's responsibilities, though routine, demanded unwavering concentration. Even small mistakes carried consequences that extended beyond the limits of the ship. He understood this clearly, yet fatigue, long patrol schedules, and the repetitive nature of the work sometimes created subtle distractions. The atmosphere inside the compartment remained quiet, shaped by the steady rhythm of static and the distant vibration of machinery. While the fleet advanced across the open sea, the operator focused on maintaining communication readiness, unaware that the upcoming minutes would test his precision in a way he had never experienced before. Outside the radio room, the ship functioned with methodical efficiency. Sailors moved along passageways, carrying equipment, delivering messages, or performing scheduled inspections. The officers on the bridge monitored navigation, adjusting the ship's heading by slight increments as they ensured alignment with the carrier group. Lookouts stationed along elevated positions scanned the horizon for distant shapes or unusual movement. Every segment of the crew contributed to the fleet's overall readiness, creating a collective effort that allowed the ships to advance safely through waters where visibility and distance offered no guarantee of safety. The morning progressed without incident, reinforcing the sense of routine that defined the daily operations of the carrier group. Yet beneath this surface of normalcy, several variables, fatigue, repetition, environmental conditions, and the delicate nature of radio equipment, moved quietly toward alignment. The fleet continued forward with steady confidence, unaware that the smallest misstep within the radio compartment would soon ripple outward across the ocean, shaping the events of the day in ways that no officer aboard could predict. The radio compartment remained one of the most confined spaces aboard the escort vessel, a narrow room filled with equipment that demanded precise handling. Electrical panels emitted a steady warmth, while indicator bulbs glowed faintly in controlled rhythms across metallic surfaces. The constant background hum formed a continuous reminder that communication represented the fragile thread binding the fleet together. The radio operator on duty sat before his console, surrounded by dials, switches, and headphone cables arranged in practiced order. Although the ship moved through calm water, the interior of the compartment felt detached from the vast world outside, insulated by layers of steel that muted the echoes of the sea. The operator had performed this role many times, developing routines that allowed him to work efficiently under pressure. He began his shift by verifying equipment stability, scanning frequency charts, and confirming that the ship maintained radio silence except for scheduled encrypted transmissions. His training emphasized caution above all else. A single lapse could expose the ship's position to distant patrols capable of intercepting even faint signals. For this reason, the operator approached each task with deliberate movements, adjusting controls slowly to maintain stability across the communication circuits. Despite his experience, fatigue lingered from previous days of continuous operations. The fleet had traveled long distances without pause, covering areas where submarine sightings and reconnaissance reports created intermittent tension. The rhythm of constant vigilance took a toll on every crew member, and the radio operator felt the effects in the gradual heaviness of his muscles and the subtle sluggishness of his thoughts. Yet the responsibility of his position offered no space for error. He continued monitoring the static-filled frequencies, listening for scheduled signals while preparing to perform routine system checks. As part of these procedures, the operator attempted to execute a brief confirmation transmission intended to verify the alignment of the ship's equipment with the fleet's communication standards. The message itself held no operational details and followed strict coding protocols. Under ordinary circumstances, the signal would travel along a narrow directional beam, minimizing the possibility of detection. The equipment required precise calibration before sending the transmission, and the operator adjusted the settings according to established instruction. However, two small variables aligned to disrupt the procedure. The first involved a minor shift in one of the tuning dials caused by earlier temperature fluctuations within the compartment. The second arose from a momentary distraction as the operator reviewed a second set of frequency indicators. These combined factors created a narrow but significant deviation in the transmission output. Instead of emitting a tightly focused signal, the equipment generated a broader, more powerful broadcast extending far beyond the intended range. Inside the radio room, the operator saw no immediate indication of the problem. The transmission completed without audible distortion, and all internal readings appeared close enough to normal to avoid raising suspicion. He recorded the signal in the communication log and resumed monitoring the frequencies, unaware that the message had traveled across a much wider arc. The quiet room concealed the magnitude of the error, offering no visual or auditory cue that something had gone wrong. Outside the compartment, the ship continued its steady movement alongside the other vessels in the carrier group. The crew went about their duties without realizing that the radio signal had broken the narrow pattern designed to protect the fleet's secrecy. The ocean remained calm, and the early daylight filtered through the haze, maintaining an atmosphere of routine naval activity. Nothing in the immediate environment indicated that an accidental broadcast had crossed the horizon and entered regions monitored by enemy forces. Yet across the ocean, far beyond the visual reach of the fleet, the unintended transmission carried enough clarity to be captured by distant listening posts. These stations, operated by enemy units trained to monitor Allied signals, recognized the structure of the coded message even without deciphering its content. Interception teams logged the signal, measuring its strength, direction, and pattern. Through this process, they gathered clues about the approximate location and movement of the American carrier group. Back aboard the escort vessel, the operator remained focused on his duties, never suspecting that a routine action had placed the entire formation at risk. The quiet room maintained its familiar cadence of static and machinery hum, offering no hint of the growing consequences unfolding beyond the ship's steel walls. The error remained hidden, waiting for its effects to reach the fleet through channels no one aboard yet anticipated. Far from a steady movement of the American carrier group, the unintended transmission traveled across an enormous stretch of open water, carried by atmospheric conditions that allowed radio waves to reach distances far beyond their typical range. In remote outposts operated by enemy forces, radio interception units maintained constant surveillance over multiple frequencies, listening for patterns that might reveal the presence of Allied ships. These units worked in small rooms lined with metal equipment, where operators monitored continuous streams of static in search of signals that deviated from natural background noise. During the early hours of that same morning, one such station detected a brief but distinct pulse within the static. The operator monitoring the frequency recognized the structure immediately. Even without access to the meaning of the coded message, he understood that the signal's characteristics aligned closely with known Allied communication formats. The signal carried a consistent rhythm, a stable tone, and an identifiable modulation pattern that marked it as the product of naval communication equipment. The operator quickly recorded the signal strength and its directional bearing, marking the first step in a process designed to translate radio clues into actionable intelligence. The station's supervisor reviewed the recording and compared it with previously intercepted data. The strength of the transmission surprised him, not because of its clarity, but because it indicated that the broadcasting vessel must be positioned within a specific region of the Pacific where Allied carriers have been expected but not confirmed. As part of routine procedure, he contacted other listening posts across a broad geographic area. These stations operated with varying levels of equipment quality, but even those with weaker capabilities detected fragments of the same signal. When combined, the scattered recordings formed a network of overlapping data points that outlined a rough approximation of the fleet's location. As the analysts assembled the information, they applied triangulation techniques that used the differences in signal arrival times and directional bearings to create a clearer estimate of the carrier group's position. Though far from exact, the resulting calculation narrowed the possible region significantly. For enemy strategists, this represented invaluable insight. Carrier groups constituted some of the most powerful assets in the Pacific theater, and locating them provided an opportunity to plan reconnaissance flights or coordinate submarine movements designed to disrupt Allied operations. In a command center located many miles away, officers reviewed the compiled data. The patterns aligned with previous intelligence reports, suggesting increased movement of Allied naval forces in that part of the ocean. The intercepted signal confirmed that the fleet had likely entered a new operational zone, perhaps preparing for upcoming engagements or repositioning in response to shifting battlefield priorities. Whatever the reason, the fact remained that an accidental broadcast had pierced the veil of radio silence and revealed the presence of the carriers. The officers acted quickly, issuing orders for long-range reconnaissance aircraft to begin preparing for flight. These planes possessed the range needed to sweep across wide areas of ocean, searching for visual confirmation of the fleet. Although the vastness of the Pacific made such missions difficult, the intelligence derived from the intercepted signal allowed the planners to focus their search on a specific region rather than exploring blindly. The accidental broadcast had not only betrayed the fleet's position, it had provided a strategic advantage to enemy units positioned to respond. Back aboard the American vessels, the crew remained unaware of the information gathering process taking place hundreds of miles away. The carrier group continued moving at a stable pace, and the daily routines proceeded unchanged. The radio operator responsible for the transmission completed his scheduled tasks and handed control to the next shift without any indication that something had gone wrong. He left the compartment believing that the day would follow the predictable rhythm of earlier patrols. Unbeknownst to him, enemy reconnaissance aircraft fueled and armed for departure, their crews beginning pre-flight inspections with practiced efficiency. Mechanics tightened fasteners, loaded supplies, and checked navigation instruments one final time. Pilots reviewed mission details, understanding that their orders depended heavily on the intelligence derived from a faint but critical radio signal. The accidental broadcast had set in motion a chain of events that extended far beyond the quiet steel walls of the American radio compartment. While the fleet moved steadily across the water, a distant search had begun. The vast sky above the Pacific, still pale with early daylight, would soon carry aircraft that followed a trajectory shaped entirely by a single moment of human error. The consequences, although not yet visible to the American sailors, had already started traveling toward them through the air and across the sea. The American carrier group continued its movement across the Pacific with unwavering confidence, unaware that distant enemy stations had begun assembling clues from the unintended broadcast. The sea remained calm, and the ships advanced in coordinated formation, producing long trails of foam that stretched behind them in fading patterns. Life aboard each vessel followed routines shaped by discipline and repetition, reinforcing the belief that the fleet remained safely concealed beneath the wide expanse of open sky. No urgent signals reached the officers, and no sightings disrupted the steady progression of the morning. Aboard the main carrier, flight deck crews prepared aircraft for routine inspection cycles, moving with coordinated precision across the wide expanse of steel. They secured tie-downs, checked fuel connections, and verified the condition of engines that would later support reconnaissance or defensive patrols. Although the crew remained alert to potential threats, no one suspected that enemy reconnaissance planes might already be preparing to fly toward their location. The atmosphere conveyed readiness, but not urgency. The silence of the sky reinforced the belief that the fleet remained undetected. Inside the operations room, officers reviewed navigation charts and assessed intelligence updates received earlier in the day. These reports indicated movement of enemy submarine units in distant sectors, but none suggested immediate danger near the fleet's current path. The officers adjusted course slightly to maintain optimal spacing and ensure that the formation remained aligned with established movement plans. Their discussions focused on logistics and coordination rather than the possibility of having been detected. The fleet's radio discipline had been consistently strong for weeks, offering no reason to consider the existence of a breach. Below deck, mechanics continued their work with steady focus, unaware of the unfolding situation beyond the horizon. They replaced worn components, cleaned equipment, and maintained a machinery essential to the carrier's operations. Their tasks required concentration and precision, creating an internal rhythm that echoed through the narrow corridors. The mechanical environment felt removed from the strategic complexities of the wider war, Yet the functioning of the fleet depended on the reliability these men ensured hour after hour. On the escort ships surrounding the carriers, lookouts scanned the horizon through binoculars, watching for distant silhouettes or unusual disturbances in the water. The visibility remained moderate due to lingering haze, yet nothing appeared out of place. The ocean stretched peacefully in every direction, offering no indication that reconnaissance aircraft might soon begin sweeping patterns overhead. The fleet maintained a pace that balanced speed with caution, moving efficiently but not urgently. In the radio compartment of the ship where the transmission error occurred, the following shift assumed control of the equipment with the same measured discipline as the earlier operator. They verified the frequency restrictions, checked signal stability, and ensured adherence to radio silence protocols. No irregular readings appeared on the consoles, and no warnings signaled that the earlier message had deviated from its intended range. The machinery displayed normal output levels, reinforcing the assumption that all procedures had been followed correctly. The accidental broadcast had left no trace for the crew to detect. Throughout the morning, the fleet continued advancing into a region of the Pacific where distant cloud formations concealed wide gaps in the sky. These gaps provided ideal routes for reconnaissance aircraft searching for naval formations. The timing, course, and atmospheric conditions combined in a way that simplified the enemy's task. While the American ships maintained confidence in their concealment, the enemy planes prepared to rise into a sky that offered both cover and opportunity. Back in the American fleet, the officers responsible for early detection relied heavily on radar sweeps conducted at regular intervals. The equipment scanned broad arcs of sky, searching for non-allied aircraft entering the region. However, at this moment, the enemy reconnaissance planes had not yet reached radar detection range. Their departure from distant bases occurred with precision, and their flight paths followed routes designed to minimize early exposure. The officers aboard the American ships remained unaware that their hidden location had already begun attracting attention hundreds of miles away. As the fleet progressed through the midday hours, the calmness of the environment reinforced the belief that the day would remain uneventful. The ships maintained formation, the crew continued their tasks, and the operations rooms monitored movement with disciplined focus. Yet beyond the horizon, reconnaissance crews followed a trajectory shaped entirely by the unintended signal transmitted earlier. The sky, which appeared vast and empty above the American fleet, had already begun to carry the silent approach of aircraft whose mission centered on locating the very ships that believed themselves concealed. The first indication that something had shifted came not from the horizon, but from a subtle reading on one of the escort ship's radar screens. A faint return appeared briefly along the outer edge of detection range, disappearing almost as quickly as it emerged. The officer monitoring the equipment hesitated before marking the contact, uncertain whether it represented atmospheric noise or a distant aircraft maintaining unusually low visibility. He adjusted the controls and continued scanning, aware that even weak signals sometimes contained early warnings. Moments later, a second faint return flickered across the screen, reinforcing the possibility that something moved within the outer reaches of the fleet's defensive perimeter. A message traveled quietly through the formation, alerting several ships to increase attention on visual and radar surveillance. The carriers continued moving steadily, unaware that enemy reconnaissance planes had already begun sweeping arcs across the region. High above the clouds, where visibility extended far beyond the limits experienced at sea level, the reconnaissance crews studied the ocean through specialized optics, searching for patterns of foam trails, ship silhouettes, or carrier wakes that might reveal the fleet's position. Their aircraft followed long, patience-driven paths, guided by calculations derived from the intercepted signal. Below them, the American ships advanced with unchanged confidence. Lookouts continued scanning the sky, but reported nothing unusual, as the reconnaissance planes maintained high altitudes and avoided direct approaches that might draw attention. The fleet's flight decks remained busy with routine inspections, and officers aboard the carriers reviewed updated intelligence reports without realizing that hostile aircraft had already begun narrowing the search. The ship's movement created faint disturbances on the water that remained visible from above, offering subtle but recognizable shapes to trained reconnaissance crews. Eventually, one of the enemy aircraft reached a vantage point where the outlines of the American formation emerged faintly beneath the shifting haze. From that altitude, the expansive pattern of wakes extending behind the ships revealed more than the vessels themselves. The reconnaissance crew used specialized lenses to confirm the presence of multiple large carriers accompanied by cruisers and destroyers. Their training allowed them to identify the size and type of vessels even before the details became fully visible. The information was too valuable to risk unnecessary delay. The observer recorded the fleet's relative position, formation structure, and direction of movement with steady precision. After completing the necessary documentation, the reconnaissance aircraft veered away, maintaining its altitude while beginning the long return to base. The crew understood that their discovery carried strategic importance. Their mission centered not on launching an attack, but on locating the fleet so that planners could organize a larger operation. The sky remained quiet as the aircraft withdrew, offering no hint to the American ships below that their concealment had been compromised. The fleet continued forward with measured confidence, unaware that its position had now been confirmed with clarity. Meanwhile, aboard the escort ship where the original transmission error occurred, the crew remained engaged in routine tasks. The radio operator, completing another equipment check, noticed nothing unusual among the readings. The ship's officers monitored radar, communications logs, and navigational data, maintaining vigilance consistent with standard procedure. None of them suspected that earlier in the day, a single misaligned transmission had carried their location into distant enemy systems, triggering a sequence of reconnaissance responses that had just culminated in the identification of the fleet. Within the operations rooms of the carriers, the day progressed without incident. Officers discussed weather conditions, the positioning of support vessels, and the scheduling of potential patrol flights. The tone remained calm, shaped by confidence in the fleet's security measures. The faint radar contacts reported earlier did not yet raise alarm, because the signals lacked consistency and remained within the realm of atmospheric anomalies. The officers saw no evidence of imminent detection, and the fleet maintained its forward movement. Unseen by the American sailors, the reconnaissance aircraft completed its long return to base and transmitted the essential findings to command personnel awaiting updates. The report contained the estimated coordinates of the fleet, the number of carriers present, and the apparent direction of movement. These details offered a foundation for planning future operations aimed at disrupting Allied naval strategy. The unintended radio signal, combined with the reconnaissance work, had now produced a complete picture for enemy planners, one built entirely upon an error made inside a quiet steel compartment hundreds of miles away. The sky above the American ships looked calm, but the silence concealed an approaching shift in the balance of awareness. The fleet still believed itself unseen, yet the information gathered by the reconnaissance crews had already begun traveling down a chain of command that would soon transform the nature of the day. The moment of recognition had passed unseen by those moving across the Pacific, leaving them unaware that the horizon no longer belonged solely to them. As the American carrier group continued moving across the Pacific with unbroken formation, the crew aboard each vessel remained unaware that the secrecy surrounding their position had already dissolved. The atmosphere on deck reflected the same disciplined calm that shaped every day of operations, with sailors completing routine checks, officers reviewing navigation data, and mechanics maintaining the machinery that held the fleet together. Nothing in the visible environment suggested that the quiet stability of the day concealed a growing threat forming far beyond the horizon. Inside the escort ship's radio compartment, the operator responsible for the earlier transmission focused on his tasks with renewed clarity, unaware that a minor misalignment of equipment had already carried consequences that extended far beyond the limits of the room. He recorded frequencies, monitored static, and confirmed that radio silence remained intact. The error he had committed left no trace on the equipment and no indication in the logs, making it impossible for him to sense the chain of events unfolding across the ocean. The quiet hum of machinery and the steady rhythm of static offered a false sense of certainty. At that same time, the reconnaissance aircraft that had located the fleet completed its journey back to its distant base, where the crews transferred their findings to intelligence officers waiting in shadowed rooms filled with maps, reports, and earlier fragments of information. The coordinates collected from high altitude, combined with previous intelligence, created a picture far clearer than anyone aboard the American ships could have imagined. The process required only minutes, yet the insight it provided would shape the decisions of commanders planning the next phase of operations. Back on the Pacific, the American fleet advanced into the late hours of the day with steady determination. The officers responsible for early detection noted occasional irregularities on radar screens, but these faint signals lacked enough strength to indicate that their position had been confirmed. The fleet continued traveling through open water with no awareness that enemy planners now possessed the information needed to direct future movements toward them. The significance of the radio error remained invisible to those whose safety depended on the secrecy it had compromised. The sun lowered gradually toward the horizon, casting long reflections across the ocean surface. The ships pressed forward, leaving trails of foam that glowed beneath the fading light. The men aboard believed they had completed another day of careful navigation, unaware that an unnoticed moment inside a quiet compartment had already exposed the fleet to distant eyes. In the vastness of the Pacific, where survival often depended on precision, a single deviation, brief, subtle, and undetected, had shifted the balance of awareness. The sea remained calm as night approached, but the silence hid a truth that the fleet had yet to learn. The smallest error could echo across hundreds of miles, altering the course of events long before anyone realized the cost. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.